Great, good start.
Detective Kelley.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give in this cause is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? You may proceed.
Good morning.
Morning.
Please tell the jury your full name and spell your last name for the record.
My name is Dale Kelley, Kelley.
And how are you employed?
I work with the City of Temple Terrace Police Department.
And what do you do for them?
I'm a detective.
And how long have you been so employed?
I've been with City of Temple Terrace for 16 years.
Okay. Detective Kelley, on May 17th, 2014, in the early morning hours, did you have an opportunity to go to the home of Jeremiah Williams?
Yes.
And who's Jeremiah Williams?
The older sister to Felicia Williams.
And did you interview her?
Yes.
And when you interviewed her, did Jeremiah Williams relate to you an incident that had happened a day or two previously between her sister Felicia Williams, and Ebony Wiley?
Yes, sir.
And what, in fact, did Jeremiah Williams tell you had happened a few days earlier?
She stated that Ebony Wiley drove by and yelled and cussed at them from a vehicle.
Okay. Did Jeremiah also further tell you that at some point she confronted Ebony Wiley about why Ebony Wiley had cussed and yelled at her and her sister?
Yes.
And what did she tell you about that?
That Ebony was just trying to tell them to go home.
And did Jeremiah also tell you that Felicia Williams, her younger sister, was not satisfied with that answer?
Yes.
And what did she tell you Felicia Williams did because she was not satisfied with that answer?
She went to Ebony's place of employment.
And her place of employment was what?
The nursing home.
And that was the following day?
I believe so.
Okay. Detective Kelley, was it also part, you had numerous duties in this investigation, is that fair?
Yes.
Okay. Was one of your duties to contact Amy McFadden with Noah?
Yes, sir.
And did you, in fact, talk to Amy McFadden on the phone?
Yes.
And did you also email her on a regular basis?
I emailed her, yes.
Okay, more than one occasion?
Yes.
Okay. Did you, in fact, provide her with the weight and the height of Felicia Williams?
Yes.
And what were the dimensions that you provided? Do you recall?
I don't recall the height, but the weight was approximately 100 pounds, I believe.
Okay, all right. If you were to be able to look at your email, might that help you remember the height?
Yes, it would.
Yes.
Would it assist you to look at your email?
Yes, sir.
If I could approach the witness, Your Honor.
Yes.
And if you just take a look at the bottom of that page, I think you'll see the email that may refresh your memory.
Very bottom.
Take
Yes,
your
sir, I
time
see
and
it.
just read it to yourself.
I got it, sir.
Okay. So having refreshed your memory, do you recall what you told her as far as the height of Felicia Williams?
Approximately 4.5 feet.
Okay, and the weight, 100 pounds?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And do you recall where you got the information about her weight being approximately 100 pounds?
That would have been, at the time, Sergeant Lowell.
Okay.
Sergeant, I'm sorry.
Sergeant Mike Lowell.
Thank you.
Were you at any time asked to contact Amy McFadden and say, and indicate to her that the weight that you initially provided was the incorrect weight?
No.
Okay. Were you ever asked to contact her and ask her whether or not, if the weight was 20 pounds more than what you'd indicated, to what degree that may have affected her drift pattern analysis?
No.
Okay. Did you at some point receive an email with a report attached from Amy McFadden?
Yes, I did.
And did you receive that on May 27th? Or was the date that it was sent to you via email, was that May 27th at 11 Pacific time?
I received it on the 27th, yes, sir.
Okay. And did you review the report?
Yes,
It's a 3-page report?
I believe so.
Okay. Well, you want to take a look at it to refresh your memory?
I believe it was 3 pages.
Okay. Do you recall that in the report,
Yes.
Detective, the conclusion of the report is that, or is it that the body was most likely deposited on the southeast corner of the Courtney Campbell Causeway?
That's what the report says, yes, sir.
Okay. Does it anywhere in this report indicate that it's equally likely that it was deposited on any other location?
I didn't see where it said equal.
Okay. In fact, does it say that it's also probable that it could have been at a different location on the north side, further to the east of where the victim was found?
Yes.
Okay. If I could approach the witness.
Yes.
I'm going to show you what's been previously identified as Defense Exhibit 2 and ask you if you recognize this.
Yes, sir.
And is that, in fact, an image that was part of that report?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right, at this time we would offer into evidence Defense Exhibit number 2. It was identified previously by Amy McFadden. And so this time we would ask them.
Are you objecting?
Yes, Judge, I would object based on our previous arguments up to the bench.
Can we approach?
Yeah, come on up.
I have no other questions for Detective Kelley. Thank you.
Okay, cross.
Can I have 1 moment, Your Honor?
Yep.
Good morning, Detective Kelley.
Good morning.
How old was Jeremicia when she was interviewed by you back in May, specifically May 17th of 2014?
I believe she was 11 years old.
11 years old?
Yes, ma'am.
When she discusses the incident that had occurred a couple days prior to Felicia Williams going missing, the incident with Ebony Wiley, is it fair to say that the emotions were running high in that household with regards to their feelings towards Ebony Wiley?
Very much so.
Was the family upset that Ebony Wiley had taken their youngest sister to an apartment, to someone's home that they didn't know?
Yes.
And that more than 12 hours later, their 9-year-old sister was still missing?
Yes.
When Jeremicia explained this incident that had occurred, did she ever tell you Ebony got out of the car and approached them,
No.
attacking them in any way?
No.
Jeremicia, in fact, told you that Ebony was telling them they needed to get home when she was yelling at them, correct?
When she later followed up with them, yes.
That Ebony told Jeremicia that she was telling them to get home.
Yes.
Was it, in fact, raining when this incident occurred with Ebony?
Yes.
Did you learn through your interviews that Felicia Williams was not the kind of girl that was going to go and run off and not contact her family?
Correct.
Was she also a young girl that was going to stand up for herself?
Yes.
Did Jeremicia, in fact, tell you about an incident when she was walking with Ebony a couple days before Felicia Williams went missing, and that a black man with an accent drove up in a silver Lexus?
I don't recall that one.
Did Jeremicia speak to you about a man that Ebony met a couple days before in a silver Lexus?
Yes.
Did she describe the man as having an accent?
Yes.
Did she describe the man as having a ring on his ring finger?
Yes.
Did she describe the man as having talked to Ebony Wiley?
Yes.
Did you talk to Jeremicia about what happened on May 16th of 2014 when Ebony came to the home to pick up Felicia Williams?
Yes.
Did Jeremicia tell you that she wanted to, in fact, go with Ebony that day?
Yes.
Did Ebony tell her she couldn't go with her that day?
Correct.
Did Ebony tell her that she wanted to speak to Felicia about her coming up to work?
Yes.
And that was the reason why she couldn't come?
Yes.
Did she also tell you that Ebony told her also that she couldn't come because she had just spent a couple days before with her?
Yes.
Did Jeremicia tell you that Ebony had arrived being driven by someone?
Yes.
She believed it to be a male?
She believed it to be.
And that it was a silver four-door vehicle?
Yes, ma'am.
And did Jeremicia tell you what clothing Felicia had been wearing when she left the house that day?
Yes.
Was it consistent with black canvas shoes,
Yes.
blue jeans,
Yes.
and a black and green striped shirt?
Yes.
When you provided the information to Amy McFadden, employed with NOAA, were you aware that the 100 pounds was an approximate weight provided by Felicia Demerson, the mother?
It was an approximate weight given to me directly from Sergeant Lowell, yes.
And that was provided by the mother on the night that her daughter was reported missing?
Yes.
And the height was also an approximation, correct?
Correct.
Sergeant Lowell, he's not a pathologist that conducts autopsies, correct?
Correct.
He didn't weigh Felicia Williams' body as far as you're aware, correct?
Correct.
Upon your review of the report that Amy McFadden authored, she also noted in that report that it's also probable that the body could have been deposited on the north side near the location or where the location of the body was located, correct?
Correct.
May I have a moment, Judge?
Yes.
When Jeremicia told you about the incident of Ebony Wiley going by on the date where she was yelling, Jeremicia didn't tell you whether or not she was in fact driving the vehicle or she was a passenger in the vehicle, correct?
Correct.
Nothing further, Judge.
All right. Redirect.
When Jeremicia was giving you the information about Ebony Wiley yelling and cussing at them, this was when you were there trying to investigate what happened to Felicia Williams, right?
Correct.
Felicia was still missing.
Correct.
And Jeremicia was doing everything she could to help you out.
Correct.
No indication that she was trying to mislead you or distract you or give you bad information.
No, none.
Okay. You were asked about whether or not you had any knowledge about the weight that the medical examiner determined that Felicia Williams was, and the fact that there was a difference between the one that you provided to NOAA and the other weight. And you said you didn't know, right?
Correct.
Okay. You're not the lead detective on the case.
No.
Okay. And the lead detective would be the one that would be responsible to review all the facts in the case, right?
Most likely, yes.
And that would be the person that would maybe ask for someone to follow up if you notice there's some sort of discrepancy in the reports.
Correct.
Okay. And the prosecutor's office also may sometimes reach out to your department and say, can you follow up on this because there's some confusion about this particular issue.
Correct.
And that was never done as far as you know.
As far as I know.
Thank you.
Okay, may this witness be excused?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you. You're free to go.
All right. Thank you.
All right, Vince, our next witness.
Dr. William Anderson.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give in this cause is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Step up this way, please. Have a seat on the witness stand.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Anderson, if you could please tell the jury your full name and spell your last name.
William Robert Anderson, Anderson.
And Dr. Anderson, tell the jury a little bit about your educational background.
Well, I attended medical school at the University of Miami a while ago, and I then specialized in the area of pathology, which is basically the study of disease processes, what goes on in the body from disease, injury, that sort of thing. And I did that at the University of Rochester, New York, Duke, and the University of North Carolina. I studied two areas of pathology initially. That was anatomic pathology, and that's reading biopsies, doing autopsies, and so forth. Then I did what's called clinical pathology, and clinical pathology is essentially managing a laboratory. When you get to a doctor's office or a hospital and get testing done, the pathologist, the clinical pathologist, is the one that actually supervises the laboratory and runs the tests and so forth. After that, I did a year of medical, legal, or forensic pathology. That's like, I used to say Quincy, but my wife says that's dating me, so more like CIS type thing. And we take the knowledge as pathologists and deal with legal proceedings. I was a hospital pathologist and medical examiner in Georgia, California, and for most of the time in Florida. And I was deputy chief medical examiner in Orlando from 1990 to 2002. And subsequently, I went into private practice. I essentially do private autopsies, consulting work. And my main portion of my time is spent, I'm a clinical laboratory director for an endoscopy center. We do biopsies on stomach, intestine, and so forth. And as the director, I read the biopsies and make the diagnosis of basically whether inflammation or tumor or whatever, polyp or whatever it happens to be. So that's pretty much what I'm doing now. I do consulting work as well.
Okay. And so how many years have you worked as a pathologist?
Well, I graduated medical school in '68, and I finished my pathology residency because I did a year also at Duke of cardiovascular pathology, dealing with the heart and so forth. So I finally finished that up and went to Los Angeles in 1976. So pretty much have been practicing pretty much since then.
So
I've been a hospital pathologist, a forensic pathologist. I was laboratory director for a hospital and a regional laboratory. We ran out of the hospital in northeast Georgia from 80 to 86 or something. And so pretty much did some medical examiner work after that, and then since 2002 pretty much been in private practice. I have worked as a contracted medical examiner in Sarasota for a year, and then I was also asked to cover the Daytona Beach office for 6 or 8 months during the mid-2000s when their medical examiner left. So I did all the homicide cases and everything there. But pretty much then as a private practice pathologist.
Approximately how many autopsies have you conducted over your career?
It's probably up to about 8,000 or 9,000 by now.
And how many of those autopsies would you say involve children?
Well, I would say in all of any sudden infant death syndrome, any child that dies suddenly without a disease is going to come to the medical examiner's office. So I would say of those 9,000, maybe 8 or 9%.
Okay. And has your work also involved children that may have been victims of sexual abuse?
Yes, of course. Anytime we do an autopsy, we look for evidence of any type of trauma, anywhere. That's the whole idea. In addition, because the forensic pathologist is really trained in looking at injuries and making diagnosis of injuries and so forth, when I first came to the medical examiner's office in Orlando in 1990, that office had been performing the sexual assault exams on the live patients, both adults and children. And Dr. Haggard had been doing that since the mid-'70s. So for the next 6 or 7 years, we also, my group, which were 3 pathologists, and we did 300 cases a year, so about 100 cases a year, we did the sexual assault exams. We knew how to preserve evidence. We knew what injuries and were not injuries and that sort of thing. So there was a logical reason to have the medical examiners actually do the clinical exams as well.
Do you still conduct autopsies?
Yes.
And how often would you say you conduct autopsies currently?
Well, I've done 3 or 4 this month already.
Okay. On an annual basis, how many would you say?
Probably 50 or 60.
Dr. Anderson, you indicate you work as a consultant. Have you testified in court previously as a consultant in these type of cases?
As an expert, basically. Even when I was at the medical examiner's office, obviously, if we determined a case to be a homicide, then obviously they would come in dealing within the state prosecution and the defense and so forth to give our findings in that case. So we determined it was a homicide. So generally, then obviously, the state would be the one that would be calling us. But as a medical examiner, remember, we're scientists, we're independent. We basically look at the facts of the case, and that's how we make our decisions.
And Dr. Anderson, how many times do you think you've testified in state courts?
Well, as deposition-wise, probably on almost all the cases we had as homicide cases in Orange County, we would have depositions at least, and I would say about 30-40% of those actually went to trial. As a consultant, I probably do 6 or 7 times a year depositions, not always in court trial, but over the years, probably total 300 or 400 times, including depositions.
And I would tend to Dr. Anderson as an expert in pathology.
Any questions?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, go ahead.
Dr. Anderson, you work at an endoscopy center. That's the majority of your income now?
Pretty much, yes.
Okay. And that's something you've been doing for several years, right? Working at an endoscopy center?
Well, it's been probably about 10 years at this particular institution, yes.
And before that, did you do that kind of work?
Well, as a pathologist, sure. I was a hospital pathologist, so we read all surgical biopsies and everything.
Well, I was asking about endoscopy, actually. Have you done endoscopy work before?
A biopsy. Well, we don't do the endoscopy. We do the biopsies.
Right.
Just like if a surgeon in a hospital takes an organ out, the pathologist looks at it. In this case, the clinician takes the tissue out and it goes to me. I make the diagnosis on it.
Okay. And you work at an endoscopy center now, correct?
I think I've answered that 3 or 4 times, yes.
Okay. Well, you went off talking about what you do there. It's not what I asked. I asked, did you work at an endoscopy center and how long you've worked at an endoscopy center, right? And before that, you worked as a medical director at a hospital. Is that correct? Is that what you told us earlier?
I was one of the laboratory pathologists and director of clinical labs.
So you have worked in and out of forensic pathology over the course of your career. You've done hospital pathology, correct?
Sure.
Clinical pathology.
Sure. We did autopsies in hospitals too, so we did autopsies all along.
Right, but those aren't forensic autopsies. Those are autopsies on people who have died of natural deaths where their family or someone else has asked you to look to see why they died,
but
right?
they still might become forensic. Occasionally we found cases where there was trauma involved and it did become a forensic case.
But the majority of your forensic practice happened when you were a medical examiner working in a medical examiner's office, correct?
I would say most of the time. I worked in Los Angeles, Georgia, and Orlando.
And I don't know if you were asked about your board certifications. Do you hold board certifications?
I'm board certified in anatomic, clinical, and forensic pathology.
When did you receive your forensic and anatomic board certifications?
That was in 1976.
And when did you receive your clinical board certification?
1980.
So 4 years later.
Roughly, yes.
Okay. So to be board certified, you have to sit to take a test, right?
Correct.
To be board certified?
Correct.
So did you have to sit to take a test for your clinical board certification
Sure.
in clinical pathology?
Sure.
All right. How many times did you sit for that test?
2.
Is that why it took 4 years?
No, I think I took in 79 and 80.
Okay. So the first time you took it, you failed it?
Well, yeah, correct.
Do you hold any other board certifications outside of clinical, anatomic, and forensic board certifications?
No.
Forensic pathology board certifications?
No.
Are you board certified in pediatrics?
I am board certified in anatomic, clinical, forensic pathology. That's it.
Are you board certified in child abuse pediatrics?
No,
Have you ever practiced as a pediatrician?
no,
Do you currently, right now, do you conduct regular routine examinations of children?
no,
Do you conduct routine examinations of children who are suspected of being physically or sexually abused?
not at the present time. I've done over my career many of them.
All right, and you did that for a short period of time, for about 5 years when you were in Orlando?
I was in Orlando from 1990 to 2002, which my calculation is 12 years.
12 years.
And then I did in Sarasota for a year.
You did.
And before that, I'd actually worked as a medical examiner in Los Angeles. I was a medical examiner for 2 of the collar counties around Atlanta. And then I was in the Naples Medical Examiner's Office in Florida for a year. So pretty much, except for the time I was in Georgia from 80 to 86 in the hospital pathologist, I've been pretty much doing forensic pathology.
And when you worked in the Orlando office, you said for 6 to 7 years you conducted sex assault examinations.
Right, from 1990 to about 1996, the medical examiners did all of the sexual assault examinations.
So for 6 to 7 years out of your entire career, you examined people, adults, and children.
Well, those are clinical patients. Now, through the whole career, obviously, doing medical examiner autopsies, forensic autopsies, we always are looking for injuries and so forth.
Okay.
And we've had a number of, many cases with sexual assault homicides.
Right.
Done.
So you have experience with sexual assault homicides.
Of course.
And sexual homicides.
Yes.
And homicides with sexual components to them.
Of course.
Okay. Yeah, and I don't want to get into an argument over semantics. I said people, I meant living people. So for the 6 to 7 years out of your entire career was when you examined people who were alive for sex assault examinations, correct?
Correct.
Okay, and that's the whole point I was trying to get to. Did you complete a fellowship in pediatrics?
No, my only fellowship is, well, I have 2 fellowships, one in cardiovascular pathology and one in forensic pathology.
Did you complete a fellowship in child abuse pediatrics?
Well, as it applies to forensic pathology, yeah, I mean, originally child abuse cases were diagnosed by forensic pathologists. That's how the whole concept became known to the public, if you will. When I was in North Carolina, I think we did the prosecution on the first sexual assault homicide that had been prosecuted in North Carolina when I was with that office.
Can I ask you a question? Did I ask you that? Is that what I asked you? Seriously, is that what I asked you?
You asked me if I had any experience. I'm telling you I have the experience.
No, I asked, did you complete a fellowship in child abuse pediatrics? That was a very specific question.
No, if that's a specialty, no.
Have you ever lectured on the subject of child abuse or child sexual abuse?
Yes, actually, when I was in the medical examiner's office in Orlando, we did a joint program with the trauma surgeons, and we call it clinical forensic medicine. And we dealt with the trauma patients who died, had certain injuries, certain complications, and so forth. So we teamed up with the surgeons, so they basically would know what these complications were through the autopsy, and then be able to treat their patients, effectively intervene, and so forth, so they would do that. And I was asked to write a textbook on that subject, which I finished in about 2000.
What subject?
Clinical forensic medicine.
Okay. I was asking you not about clinical forensic medicine, but I was asking you about, have you ever lectured on the topic of child abuse or child sexual abuse?
Well, it was in lectures that we gave, as I started to say. We gave lectures also based upon our dealings with the trauma surgeons. We gave a workshop with a surgeon, myself, and a homicide detective from Orlando at the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. And we had that workshop for about 6 or 7 years. Every year we would give that workshop, and it was a half-day workshop. So, yeah.
So in that half-a-day workshop, one of the topics out of many that you talked about was child sex abuse?
Well, that was among other things, but from the standpoint of injury patterns, looking at what the injuries are, that's what we talked about.
Okay, so it wasn't specifically about child sexual abuse?
Not specifically, but the injuries are injuries.
Do you have any published articles solely on the topic of child abuse or child sexual abuse?
No, I did a textbook, and then I've done it recently. I did a chapter on the necessity of expert witnesses maintaining pertinent attitudes toward testifying in court.
You wrote a recent textbook that, well, within the last several years, correct?
A chapter on a textbook, yes.
A chapter in a textbook. I have one moment, Your Honor.
Yes.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Okay, you may proceed with direct.
Thank you, Your Honor. Doctor, what were you asked to do in this case?
Well, essentially, I was asked to look at the case and give my opinions as to what happened, what the cause of death was, and what essentially we could learn from looking at the actual objective information, the autopsy report, the photos, and the evidence collected.
And doctor, what did you examine initially as far as when you started looking at the evidence in this
Well,
case?
that's pretty much it. I looked at the autopsy report. I actually looked at the pictures first. And then I looked at the autopsy report and some of the evidence that was collected and the reports of that evidence. And that pretty much was what I relied upon. As a scientist, you want to basically make a decision based on as much hard data as you can. In other words, hard data is the actual facts, the photos, the tissues, what you look at under the microscope, the actual report of what the pathologist saw. What I do avoid is what we call soft data, people's opinions, other people's reports, other people's depositions. And I don't ever include those in any of the cases because I want to take just a clear, objective look at what the actual findings show in a particular case.
Okay, so to make sure I understand, you initially look at the photographs,
Correct.
and then you look at the medical examiner's report of what the medical examiner observed during the autopsy.
Correct.
Okay. As far as other people's opinions and testimony, you don't want to look at that initially.
Correct. And I've been basically, since we dealt with the clinicians on how to handle these types of situations, it's become very clear that you don't want to bias yourself in, for instance, what the police think of the situation. I've had a number of cases where the story changes, obviously, all the time, but the forensic evidence doesn't change. You still have the forensic findings.
In looking at the photographs, do you observe what you would describe as artifacts, and do you also observe what you would describe as injuries?
Yes, and you have to be very careful about that because post-mortem injuries relays entirely the wrong message to even other pathologists that are looking at it, but let alone other people that are not familiar with pathology. An injury basically causes damages and then the body reacts to it. So you can tell, for instance, if an artifact has been introduced, you will have such things as maybe a tear in the skin but no bleeding, as we had in this case, multiple tears in the skin but no bleeding, which means that's post-mortem. Circulation had stopped before those changes had occurred. And it's very important to distinguish between what is artifact and what is actual trauma. In this particular case, there was significant post-mortem artifact on the photo, evident on the photos taken, and there were also, particularly on the internal photos, there was evidence of injury that did occur while the child was alive.
Tell the jury about, first of all, the injuries that you observed that appeared to you took place while the child was alive.
Basically, there was a pattern of injuries. There was hemorrhage in both muscles of the anterior chest, and there was hemorrhage in the lower portion of the larynx and the muscles around the larynx, which is the windpipe.
Okay. Were there also some injuries to the head?
Yes, there were several multi-directional injuries to the head. You could see on the scalp areas of hemorrhage, and I thought that there were probably at least 3 different impact injuries in different directions, which means essentially if you've got them in different directions, you can't explain 2 injuries with one traumatic event. So I think there was probably at least 3 traumatic head injuries as well.
Okay. And could you explain to the jury, or can you explain to the jury that how you were able to determine that you're actually seeing injuries without actually having to show it on the photographs?
Well, sure. What is, there's reddening, there's hemorrhage in the musculature. In other words, the muscles of the neck, you can see the pictures, and I'm sure you've seen them already, pictures of the areas of hemorrhage in the neck. But important to me was the fact that there was a pattern. In other words, it wasn't a typical neck strangulation where you got a lot of injury to all of the muscles up here in the neck. You also had those other injuries as well as some in the larynx. So that would indicate to me that a force was applied across the upper chest, and of course probably involving the lower portion of the larynx as well.
Did you arrive at an opinion as to the cause and manner of death?
Well, I think I agree with the pathologist that I believe this was a compression type injury where something was forced down on the chest. I think it was, judging by the fact that her lungs are very edematous or heavy, filled with fluid, although we didn't have any microscopic slides taken to that to look at under the microscope. But from the gross description in the pictures, it looks like there was a lot of fluid, and of course the lungs were heavy. So this would indicate that it was not a sudden death, which wasn't normal 1 minute, died next minute. Probably the child survived, not necessarily conscious, but survived probably in the neighborhood of 15 to 20 minutes while the force was still being applied. Now, because of the fact that it required sustained force, I would say that it's virtually would be diagnostic of a homicide, something inflicted by someone else, and that pressure maintained.
And could you elaborate a little bit on the pressure that you're talking about? How you believe that took place?
Well, I think there's a good chance there was either somebody pressing their arm down or maybe kneeling on the patient for a period of time. But within probably less than a minute, she would have become unconscious. And the fact that then is still maintained long enough to actually cause the death was why we classify it as a homicide.
Would that be consistent with a person weighing 150 plus pounds kneeling down or on top of the child?
It would be very consistent with that. I would say that almost any adult even, if you have 150 pounds placed on your chest and held there for 15 minutes, you're probably not going to survive, even an adult. So I would say that this could have been inflicted by any adult person, even possibly a large child, but it would probably be a pretty large child. I would say that inflicted by an adult. And as a pathologist, that's as far as we can go. We can't determine whether this was a man or a woman, or for sure if it was an elbow or a knee, but most likely with that distribution across the kid's chest, it was either coming down with an elbow or coming down on a knee right in that area. And that causes then interference with the ability to breathe. The child's struggling while they're breathing, so the heart's beginning to fail, so the fluid builds up in the lung. And over a period of time, 15, 20 minutes or so, that's going to result in enough fluid in the lung that the child's not going to get oxygen anymore, and essentially is going to be dead.
And so the fluid in the lung is from edema?
Yes, that is what edema is. When the heart begins to fail, blood's not circulating properly, it begins to, for a better word, back up. So then fluid, you got red blood cells and you got serum in the blood, 2 parts. And that serum then begins to go across the little membranes between where the blood flows and where the air flows. Those are called the alveoli. And when that fluid fills into the air spaces, then you don't have room for the air anymore. So that fluid then cuts off the ability of circulation to continue. And the more pronounced that is, the longer period of time it took to develop. And these lungs are about twice what they should be for this child. So I'm thinking it was a sustained period. So that's why I would agree with the designation of this as homicide.
When you say that it's about twice as big as they should be, the lungs for this
Not
child.
as big as heavy. As heavy.
Heavy. Okay. And when you're saying that, is that the fact that the child weighs 120 pounds? How does that factor
No, that
in?
has nothing to do with it. The lungs normally in a child of her size should weigh in the neighborhood of 150, 200 grams, and hers were double that size. Now, if you figure you got an air-filled lung and you weigh it full of air, it's going to weigh a lot less. That would be normal. When that gets filled with fluid, you've got all that weight of the fluid, and that's what causes the lungs to become heavy and edematous, and that's essentially what pulmonary edema is.
So I want to make sure I understand. It's your belief that the way this happened, rather than strangulation to the neck, that it's pressure on the chest.
Yeah, because we've got that distribution of injuries. We've got almost a photo of something coming across the neck causing hemorrhage here, and hemorrhage here. So that's something coming down all the way across. We're just grabbing here. There's nothing that should cause hemorrhage into the musculature. But the effect is the same as far as the death. I mean, it's basically it's an injury that is going to cause, if not removed, if the force is not removed, it's going to cause death. So that makes, and I don't see any indication that it was removed for over that period of time. So that's why I would call this a homicide.
Okay. Because of the duration that's required, in your opinion, it couldn't be accidental.
No, absolutely not.
Okay. What about the issue of whether or not Felicia Williams was alive when she was placed in the water? You have any opinions on that?
Well, it was sustained for a period of time. Got her into the pulmonary edema. Could she have been alive for a few minutes? Probably unconscious. Maybe even somebody thought they were dead. But when placed in the water, but we don't know the sequence from the scientific standpoint. We don't know the sequence of events. Did this occur? Did this pressure occur, by the edge of the water, and then she went in? I mean, certainly, if it took longer than a few minutes from the time the pressure was relieved until she went into the water, she would not have survived more than a couple of minutes. So it would have to be pretty close. But again, I don't want, as a scientist, I don't want to start prejudging the circumstances, because we really don't know what the circumstances were, at least not from my standpoint as a forensic pathologist. So I want to just look, that's precisely why I would just look at the injuries and not get involved in what somebody thinks or what the law enforcement thinks or what patients or the people say happened and so forth. You have to be very careful, because it's been my experience, particularly during doing sexual assault exams on living patients, that about 5% of the time, after we're through with the exam and find something that contradicts with the story given by the victim, the victim's story will be amended and changed, and a lot of times they'll just admit that it was false. So that 5% of the time is certainly something that's worth looking at from the standpoint of, well, can you absolutely trust what everybody is saying happened? And you really can't. But you don't need to as a forensic pathologist. I mean, we're looking at the injuries, and we're looking at the time it took the individual after the pressure was applied to die, and the fact that it would have taken sustained pressure to cause those injuries, in my opinion.
Okay, and I want to talk about your findings as it relates to potential sexual injuries in a little bit, but are you able, based on the evidence that you reviewed, are you able to determine a time of that?
Well, the child was not decomposed. But as far as the time of death, within hours or so, no. It's very inaccurate to try to determine that. And basically the best we could do was say that because of the edema, from the injury to the time of death, there was a period of time, because that's where we can see what the body's reacting. But within a few hours, or even 12 to 24 hours, we couldn't be sure of actually the time of death, certainly.
Okay. And as far as the based on the injuries that you see and the edema, I think you'd indicated that loss of consciousness would happen fairly fast?
Yeah, not only from that, but the fact we've got three incidents of recent head trauma, which could certainly stun or even make the child unconscious.
Okay.
But from the lack of oxygen alone, it's usually going to be probably no more than a minute or two before there is consciousness.
And then once there's loss of consciousness with the injuries that you're seeing, is it necessarily apparent to someone to the perpetrator or someone who's present that the child is still alive?
No, I don't think it wouldn't be obvious either way, which further would support my theory that this is a homicide, because obviously there was no resuscitation attempted, or no, as you would expect in a situation where it was inadvertent or something else that had the child basically dead. Even if the child was still alive and you thought they were dead.
Doctor, what's the time period from loss of consciousness until you would expect the child to be dead?
That's what I'd say. Judging upon the pulmonary edema, again, we don't have micros, but it's not really that critical in this case. I would say that probably in the neighborhood of 10 to 15 to 20 minutes max.
Okay. So if the murder took place, for example, in Temple Terrace, and the body was dropped in Tampa Bay, and the time of travel is further than 20 minutes, the child would likely not be alive at the time.
Right, and I think you got to remember that what my theory or my interpretation is that this pressure was maintained. So you probably wouldn't be, if you were being transported in a car, there'd probably be no way that would be maintained. So it was maintained until the death occurred, and then probably, if transported, because again, we don't know where it occurred.
Sure.
I don't know where it
Right,
occurred.
you don't know where it occurred. But hypothetically, if. Doctor, the artifacts that we see on the outside of the body, I think you've indicated that they don't really assist you in determining the cause and manner of death.
No, they're postmortem artifacts, and I think the only concern I had at all with the autopsy report was that some of that was lumped in together with the injuries, and it should be clear that and particularly
This time is non-responsive.
Sustain the objection.
Has to be a non-responsive or irrelevant?
Yes, non-responsive. Ask your next question.
All right. Is it your opinion that the artifact injuries should not be included for purposes of explaining the cause and manner of death?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Whether or not the artifact should not be included in the discussion for purposes of determining cause and manner of death.
Overrule the objection. Go ahead.
no, because they are just that. They're artifacts. The thing occurred after the event, in this case, the pressure, that ultimately ended up in the death of the child. So the artifacts are difficult for, say, the average person not associated with these, not seeing this type of thing all the time, may well be misinterpreted.
Doctor, I'm going to show you what's already in evidence, and this is states KB 31. Doctor, you notice this area right here that I've circled on the diagram.
Yes.
What are we looking at here?
This basically is an area of whitening. There's been denuding of the first layer of skin, or basically rubbing away of the first layer of skin. And we don't see underneath it, we see basically a white It's actually the dermis. It's under the epidermis. The fact that this is just pure white indicates that that was how we would tell the difference if this occurred pre-mortem or ante-mortem, because if it's pre-mortem injury, then you're going to have basically reddening and hemorrhage in that area where the trauma occurred. I mean, that's how we diagnose the trauma. So this would be consistent with a post-mortem change, a post-mortem artifact.
Okay. Does that in any way suggest that there was any type of sexual battery on Felicia Williams?
No.
Does it in any way suggest that there's been that it's the result of blunt force trauma of any sort?
No.
Okay. Now, you indicated, and I'm going to take this down, but I want to talk a little bit more about that particular, that you would refer to that as an artifact?
Correct.
And let me make sure I don't mess this up. You indicate that you can, by looking at the whiteness of it, and that you don't see any what appears to be blood, that's what assists you in determining that it's a post-mortem.
Correct.
artifact.
Correct. And it was in an unusual position, so that's why I basically was able to determine what most likely caused it.
And before we, what do you believe most likely caused that?
Well, in the medical examiners, if I could have that or tell it. When the medical examiner,
If I could, you want to look at part of the medical examiner's information, or do you
Yes,
recall it?
the information, well, I think we need to show what.
Show. If I could approach.
Yes.
I'm going to show you what's marked as Defense Exhibit 3, and ask you just to review it for yourself. I'm not going to show it to the jury, but does that assist you in your evaluation of how those injuries occurred?
Well, yes.
Okay. And how does it assist you in evaluating how the injuries occurred?
If we could show it, what is called the chain of custody? A chain of custody.
Say that again now.
Well, if I could, it's
You
easier
can't-
to show it, but all right, if I can't show it. There's an evidence submission is what's called a chain of custody, chain of evidence.
I'm going to sustain the objection. It's not the question.
Doctor, have you reviewed the medical examiner's records?
Yes.
Okay. In reviewing the records, and that's part of what you do for purposes of evaluating what happened or didn't happen in this
Correct,
case.
as I indicated before.
And, Doctor, when you review those records, do you review when the medical when the autopsy took place?
Yes,
And when did the autopsy take place?
on the 18th.
Okay. Did you also review records that suggest that there was things that were done to the victim in the medical examiner's office prior to the autopsy?
Yes, the chain of custody.
Well, don't worry about the chain of custody. What is it that you believe took place, based on your review of the medical records, prior to the autopsy?
Objection, Your Honor, for all of this.
You can go ahead and answer. Go ahead.
The medical examiner did the exam on the 17th, not the 18th. On the 17th, that evidence was turned over to the crime laboratory, and in doing that, signatures, dates, and all are put down when they got it. So before those pictures were taken, this area was swabbed for DNA, and I've had this happen before, that in doing the swabbing, you may rub off some skin, and so forth.
Judge, objection to speculation.
Sustain as a
I move to
speculation.
strike.
Grant the motion. That last response, based upon the witness's experience, is stricken from the record.
Can we approach, Your Honor?